I came up here in 1987 from Sydney, purchased this property in Lyndon, which backs onto the national park. I noticed that all the plants on this heathland, on this ironstone, this sandstone with a lot of iron in it, were growing what seemed to me at that stage on nothing. That all the trees here, all the magnificent eucalypts, the tea trees, the banksias, the very small plants, the fungi, all these things were just growing on nothing. I didn't expect that to be the case moving up here, and I became more interested in what I was seeing under my feet than what I could see on the horizon. I call my art practice the orchid penjing. It's not about miniature gardens, it's not about bonsai. What it's really about is taking a fragment of the bush up here, and a fragment of the bush is simply, in my view, certainly where I am, a fragment of stone with a plant growing on it. I've picked orchids because they are simply very lithophytic. They're stone growing, they're very diverse, and they're very interesting, and they're ignored. Like a lot of small plants, when people go out into the bush, they'll look at a great tree, they'll step back to look at the tree and put their foot on a native orchid. So it was my interest in that, but it was also a desire to show people how wonderful this relationship between a plant and a stone is. And it is a dynamic relationship, it's a fabulous relationship. And to observe the other parts of the plant, for instance, the roots of the plant growing over the stone. And I think people are blinded by that, they're blinded by the flowers. And I think the job of artists is to show people the obvious. I mean, I think one of the lines I like most of all just is what Oscar Wilde once said. He said, until Whistler painted the fogs of London, people in London didn't see the fogs. When he painted them, they saw the fogs and they started walking into lampposts. Now, I think it's a bit like this. People have said to me, oh, well, this is a great idea. Wow, I didn't realise you could actually grow orchids on rock and put them in your house. Well, it's the obvious, isn't it? And I think that's really the job of artists, just to show people the obvious. And that's my intention, is to show, to bring into places where people can see the bush up close, which they may not see when they're bushwalking. Well, what you're looking at now is the first orchid penjing plant that I ever did. It was done last century. I'd love to say that, in 1998, thereabouts, 1998, 99, I think. And I simply, the rock you're looking at, I recall, they were doing the road widening at Lyndon, or they were doing the sewer, I can't remember, and there was just rubble everywhere, and I just picked up this rock. I did very little to it, and then I tied on a couple of bush orchids. And it's still growing. It's never flowered, but that's irrelevant. I just like the sculptural look of it, and I just like the way it is. And that was really the first one. The way it's going, it'll outlive me. Well, what you've got here is a group of orchid penjing works, orchids on stone, that I've done over the last 15 years. And there's two sorts of processes I've used. The works at the front is just very simple. It's really just a stone that I've placed an orchid into, and then I've weighed it down with another rock or whatever and let it grow in that cavity. This one here, in fact, the orchid actually fell onto this rock from another orchid, and they're native orchids, and I placed a stone on the orchid and put a little red dot there for some reason, I don't quite know why. And it's just grown really beautifully, and you can notice also it's got the aerial growths, which are called kick ears, growing through the stone, and it's just about to flower. Then you come to a very interesting work. This was done in about 1998, 99, and it's a different orchid. It's a Sarcocalis hartmanii, and different to the common bush orchid. The thing that I like about this orchid is that the extraordinary root growth all over it. And you know, the thing about it that also fascinates me is that this plant's never flowered, which doesn't bother me in the slightest, but it's this form, I call it the horse, and it has this sort of hair or form on top. This form has remained exactly like that all those years, which absolutely intrigues me, and there's fantastic moss growing all over it. And that really, if I could sum up my ideal of this art form, it's this form here. It's combining some sculpture that I wanted to do, combined with this fabulous growth. The fact that it'll never flower, or it may flower, is irrelevant. For the workshop, however, to learn how to do this, we're making something like this, which is a piece of sandstone from a quarry, Winmalee quarry, an offcut. I like to get the offcuts from there. Just rubble that's really being probably purchased for landfill or for some landscaping, but to pick up the stone from there. I cut the stone up for the participant and cut a ridge around for tying string into it, and then essentially the person who does the workshop then works on the stone to their own requirements and the plant's requirements. Yeah, they're rather beaut examples, I think, of the process, particularly for the workshop, what you're going to do and what you might end up with at the end of the day or after a few years. The orchids running along here just simply are on bush rocks that are at the back of my property, and you can see that they're big bush orchids. The roots are cascading down over the rock, and there's about 4 of them there in a row. Over here, I might describe as my works in progress, things that I'm doing at the moment. They range from growing exotic orchids, like this orchid here. I quite like this piece because it's sort of got a bit of everything in it. You've got the sandstone base, you've got a tree fern, on top of which is growing an orchid from South America called the Stanhopea that produces the most outrageous flowers and scents. And then I've got little bird's nest ferns growing all over it, and I really, and a fern over here. I really do like that whole mix of things. There's native orchids running through here, growing on ironstone and such. And here's another example of an extraordinary orchid. This one is actually from South America, and Laelia sabines. And what's amazing is this incredible root growth growing into an Australian native tree fern, and that produces spikes that can be 4 feet long. So this is where I grow things, and around this side, this is the southeastern side of the property, and that's basically where my orchid nursery is, and there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plants growing there, both exotic and native orchids. This Dendrobium speciosum or bush orchid came up here with me in 1987, like the smaller one up the back, and I planted it there, and I've watched it over the years. And this year, after 26 years, I've never seen anything like it. It's covered in flower spikes, and it's going to be covered in flowers and covered in bees. And it reminds me of my first bush orchid I ever saw when I was a kid at my uncle's place in Lugano. It really got me going, I suppose. So this art form I've described as orchid penjing is certainly not about speed. It's about actually observing something over a long period of time. That's certainly in sync with what the Chinese artists are interested in their form of penjing, which is simply growing a plant in a container or in some object. When I started sculpting, I thought about welding and I thought about practices that use a lot of heat to produce an artwork. And I also thought about what I was doing as well, which was growing plants on stone. And it seemed to me that they were very different, and that one was actually I could describe it as endothermic. I like this idea. I like the idea of doing art in which what I'm doing is carbon neutral. I do use some power from the grid in some of the stonework, but essentially most of the work I do involves me growing a plant on a stone, and in many cases, in most cases of the show making ground, these are just bush rocks from my property that I've grown plants on. So I suppose you'd say that what my practice is in fact carbon negative, in that the plant growing on the stone produces oxygen. It's called an endothermic art practice for this reason, that the word endothermic means in chemistry taking in heat as opposed to exothermic. So this is why I'm interested in that word. I'm interested in that word also to make artists think, and myself, about what we do and not just what we make. I mean, I don't think art is art really is for art's sake. I think it's an old-fashioned view of art. Art's always been about something bigger. And I think we face the challenges of the future require artists to think big and get on, in many cases, the front line of change. And I think the word endothermic points in that direction.